Chapter 19. The circle closes by morning. Rose Hill was a village on edge. News of the break-in at Arthur Montgomery's studio had traveled faster than the fog rolling in from the moors. The whispers were fevered, now no longer about scandal, but about danger, real, tangible danger. Locks were checked twice. Curtains were drawn early. And still, eyes peered through the gaps. But inside the Rose Hill Inn, Benoit Blanc was already 3 moves ahead. He stood at the center of the inn's modest drawing room, a chalkboard before him, notes pinned and layered in a delicate web of logic. At the top, a triangle drawn in white. Each corner bore a name. Arthur Montgomery Lucien Deneuve the Handler in the center. Hidden eye. Clara, seated nearby with tea gone cold in her hands, stared at the board. "Why a triangle?" she asked. Softly, Blanc didn't answer right away. He walked to the window, looked out across the green toward the gallery. "It's a symbol of structure," he finally said. 3 sides, each one supporting the others. Remove one, and the whole collapses. He turned back to her. Arthur was the keeper. Deneuve was the creator. But this third figure, the handler, they're the destroyer. The one sent to erase what the other 2 tried to preserve. Clara nodded slowly. "And now I'm in the triangle." "No," Blanc said. "You're the reason it still exists." By mid-afternoon, Constable Swan returned with the list of names from the gallery logs, .30-6 entries. But only one stood out. A technician who'd come twice in the last month to inspect wiring in the West Wing. Name, Emil Gaubert. ID verified by Lady Elthorpe. Nationality, French. Blanc's jaw tightened. "It's him," Swan frowned. But no background check flagged anything, because Emil Gaubert doesn't exist. Not in any public database. But I've seen the name before used on fake shipping manifests tied to missing artwork. He's a ghost. Then what do we do? Swan asked. Blanc turned to Clara. "We bait the trap?" That night, the village gallery held an impromptu memorial viewing of Arthur Montgomery's private collection, announced quietly, shared only among a select group of Rose Hill's residents and Arthur's closest colleagues. The piece, "The Resistance," a newly discovered canvas to be unveiled at the climax. A lie, but one Gaubert couldn't resist. It was too tempting. 2. Final. Blanc watched the guests trickle in with casual smiles and murmured admiration. He wore a dark suit. No tie, hands clasped lightly behind his back. Clara stood near the back wall, composed but alert. Hidden officers were positioned at each exit. At precisely 8:37 p.m. The lights flickered once, then again. And then they cut out entirely. 3 seconds of darkness, then a scream. Then the emergency lights kicked in cold and blue. At the front of the room, the covered easel stood now empty. But it wasn't the missing painting that mattered. It was the man lying unconscious behind it. Security and Swan rushed forward. Blanc followed slowly, calm amidst the chaos. He knelt beside the fallen figure. The fake name badge had already slipped. No more Emil Gaubert, just a man with an unmarked burner phone in his jacket, and a spiral in a square stitched onto the inside. Lining. Blanc looked up. "He came to take it," he said softly, but found nothing left to steal. Later that night, in the quiet of the studio, Clara and Blanc stood over the real painting Deneuve's canvas from the crypt, now safely in police custody. "We'll move it to a secure archive," Swan said. "Off-site, quietly. It won't be touched without court approval." Blanc nodded. "Good, but that won't stop the ones behind Gaubert. They'll send another." "What do we do?" Clara asked. Blanc looked at her. "You finish what Arthur started. You tell the story. Not in oil, not in secret, but in words." She hesitated. "You think anyone will believe it?" He smiled. People don't believe stories because they're neat. They believe them because they're human. The next morning, as the sun rose over Rosehill, Clara sat at Arthur's desk. The letter was already written to the curators of the National Museum of Modern Art. Paris subject: The truth withheld she. Signed her name without hesitation. Blanc, standing in the doorway, gave a small nod. One triangle had collapsed, but a new one had just begun to form. One built not on secrecy, but on witness. Chapter 20. The last brushstroke. A month had passed. Rosehill, ever the stoic English village, resumed its rhythms. The postman whistled again. The grocer smiled at every customer. Children kicked a football across the green as if no murder had ever touched the cobbled lanes. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Truth had been aired. And Clara Whitaker, formerly apprentice, now author, was its custodian. The letter she'd sent to the National Museum of Modern Art in Paris had not gone unanswered. Within 2 weeks, the director herself had visited Rosehill, standing beside Clara and Benoit Blanc in Arthur's studio, gazing upon the canvas that had caused so much pain in silence. The museum agreed to display both paintings, Deneuve's La Verite Retenue and Arthur's Hidden, side by side in a private exhibition, but only on one condition: that the accompanying plaque would tell the full story. And Clara would write it. She did, with care, with grief, with fire. She wrote not just of Arthur's murder, but of what came before it, his hidden connection to a rogue artist, the secret that threatened to erase both of them, and the quiet strength it took to confront truth with creation instead of destruction. The story was published in the London Review of Art, then reprinted in the Times. Within days, it went viral online. Arthur Montgomery was no longer a recluse. He was a resistor, and Clara was his voice. On the morning of the exhibition's unveiling, Benoit Blanc stood beside Clara on the gallery steps in Paris. "You've done a brave thing," he said, glancing over at her. Clara, now dressed with quiet confidence, gave him a wan smile. "I didn't do it for courage." He tilted his head. "No, I did it because I loved him, and I won't let him disappear." Blanc looked at the doors behind them. Inside, critics and curators and quiet dignitaries walked between the canvases in silence. Most didn't know what they were truly looking at, but a few did, and they would carry it forward. Later that afternoon, back in Rosehill, Blanc prepared to leave. His suitcase was modest. His demeanor, as always, calm. Clara walked him to the edge of the green. "Will you ever come back?" she asked. He gave her a thoughtful smile. "Perhaps, when the world stops painting shadows and starts painting light." She chuckled. "That may take a while." Blanc reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope. He handed it to her. "Arthur left this in the gallery's deposit box, unmarked, but I believe it was meant for you." Clara opened it as Blanc walked away. Inside was a simple sketch. A woman standing in front of a mirror, holding a brush, and underneath it, Arthur had written, "The truth was never in the eye. It was always in the hand." Blanc stepped into the waiting taxi, hat in hand. As they pulled away from the village, he looked out the window one last time, and that's when he saw it, standing at the edge of the chapel grounds, in the shadow of the old stained glass window. A man in a gray coat, still, watching. Their eyes met. Blanc didn't smile. He simply nodded. He knew the handler had been caught. The network scattered, but behind every destroyed canvas, there is always one last collector. Case of Arthur Montgomery was closed, but the world of Deneuve still open. And Benoit Blanc would be ready. Chapter 17. The crypt beneath. By midday, the clouds had thickened again, rolling over Rosehill in heavy gray waves. Clara stood beside Benoit Blanc at the gates of the old chapel, her breath visible in the sudden chill that had crept into the July air. The place had stood dormant for decades, its bell long since silenced, its pews layered in dust. Yet today, something about it felt expectant. They were met at the side entrance by Trevor Baines, the local groundsman and self-proclaimed keeper of Rose Hill's ancient oddities. He held a rusted ring of keys and a torch that flickered even before they entered the gloom. "You're certain about this?" Trevor asked as they stepped into the sanctuary. "No one's touched the crypt in 40 years. The last time I was down there, I nearly fell through a rotten stair." Blanc gave a calm nod. "All the better. Secrets don't survive in well-lit places." Clara followed silently, heart beating against her ribs like a fist against a locked door. They descended narrow stone steps beneath the altar, spiraling into cold earth. The air was stale with time. Dust floated in tight columns, where Trevor's torch passed over carved archways and sunken tombstones embedded in the wall. The crypt was a long rectangular chamber, no bigger than a railway carriage, lined with collapsed shelving and old wooden crates. It looked untouched by any living soul for years, but it wasn't empty. Blanc stopped at the far wall, where a canvas, wrapped tightly in tarpaulin, leaned between two broken crates. He knelt, brushing away cobwebs. Carved into the base of the wooden crate that held it was the mark, a crescent, and 3 dots. Clara gasped softly. "Deneuve." Blanc slowly unwrapped the tarpaulin. Inside was a second painting similar in style to the one hidden behind Arthur's panel, but even more severe. Stark monochrome brushstrokes, clawed through with metal rather than brush. A single figure, faceless, crouched within a room that bled into the edges. On the floor of the painted room, a photograph, a real one glued onto the canvas. Arthur, standing in his studio, looking directly into the camera. Beneath it, in scratched red ink, were the words, "The Last Witness." Clara stumbled back. Trevor swore. Blanc's eyes narrowed. "My God!" They carried the painting into the daylight. It was heavy, not just in weight, but in presence. The village green seemed colder when it passed by. Clara said little. She kept one hand to her mouth, as if afraid a sound would break. Something sacred. Back in Arthur's studio, they laid the painting flat and studied it more closely. Blanc turned to Clara. "Arthur didn't just hide this to protect Deneuve. He hid it to protect himself." Clara nodded slowly. "That's why he painted Hidden Eye. It was his counterstatement, his way of reclaiming the narrative." Blanc pointed to the photograph affixed to the canvas. "This photo wasn't taken by Arthur. He's the subject." "Which means someone was in the studio," Clara whispered. "Watching him," Blanc said. "Before the murder, before Simon, before all of it." He flipped the painting over. There, in the corner of the backing, was a smudged fingerprint in black paint, and beside it a new symbol. Not Deneuve's, something else. A tiny, crude spiral. Inside a square. Blanc's jaw tightened. "I've seen this before," he murmured. Clara looked at him. "Where?" "In Montreal, after the fire." This was the mark tagged onto a surviving wall. The local police thought it was just graffiti, but Leroux believed it was a signature, a second party. Someone who followed Deneuve. "An imitator?" Clara asked. "Or worse," Blanc said, "a collector." That evening, Blanc contacted Leroux again via encrypted line. He sent him the photograph of the crypt painting, the symbols, the attached photo of Arthur. Leroux responded within 10 minutes. "Benoit, that square spiral is real. We've seen it on at least 4 illegal recoveries. We believe it belongs to a private network art traffickers who target subversive work. They don't just steal paintings. They erase the history around them. If Arthur had this, he was being watched. And now that painting's surfaced again, you and Clara may be next." Be careful. Blanc closed the message and turned to Clara, who sat cross-legged on the studio floor, flipping through Arthur's old sketchbooks. We have to be prepared, he said. For what? She asked. He looked at the uncovered canvas. For someone who wants silence. That night, as the village slept, a figure moved through the shadows behind the chapel. Their gloved hands reached into a pocket and pulled out a photograph. It was of the painting from the crypt. Stamped across the back was a square, spiral. And beneath it, found, recover immediately. Chapter 18. A visitor in the night. The wind picked up just after midnight. It howled low across the eaves of Rosehill, like a warning whispered too late. The village, tucked into its sleepy folds of brick and ivy, gave no sign of what was coming. No barking dog, no flickering lamp. And certainly no scream, because the figure that crept across the churchyard path moved like smoke, purposeful, silent. It paused outside Arthur Montgomery's studio, watching. Inside, Clara Whitaker lay curled on the couch beneath an old throw blanket, surrounded by photographs and sketches. She hadn't meant to fall asleep. Her notebook still lay open on her lap, pen uncapped, a smear of ink drying where her hand had drifted across the page. The lanterns were dimmed. The door was locked. But the window above the back sink wasn't. The latch hadn't caught. At exactly 2:14 a.m., Clara stirred. A soft click. She sat up, disoriented. Arthur? No answer. Only the faint creak of a floorboard. She froze. For a moment, she thought it was the building settling. Then another sound closer. A footstep. Real. Clara moved. Slowly, slipping her feet into her shoes without rising. Her heart pounded. She reached for the torch on the desk, her fingers trembling, and clicked it on. A circle of light. Nothing in front of her. She turned, just in time to see a dark shape vanish behind the easel. Someone was inside the studio. Clara backed toward the front door. Who's there? She called. No reply. Then the canvas, the one from the crypt, toppled to the floor. Clara jumped. The sound cracked through the silence like a gunshot. She ran. At that same moment, across the green at the Rosehill Inn, Benoit Blanc sat bolt upright in bed. Something had snapped inside him. Instinct. A pattern. A noise he hadn't heard, but felt. He didn't even put on his shoes, just grabbed his coat, keys and torch, and sprinted across the empty street, barefooted on the cobbles. Coat flaring like a cape. As he rounded the chapel, he saw it, the back window of Arthur's studio open, and the front door ajar. Clara. Inside, she had barricaded herself in the supply closet. Breath ragged, the torch clenched like a weapon. She could hear them moving, deliberate, patient. Not a robber, a searcher. The door creaked. Clara. Blanc's voice. She bolted out of the closet just as a hand reached around the far canvas. Blanc burst through the front door, torch raised, and caught a glimpse of a hooded figure sliding out the back. Into the hedges. Clara ran into him, breathless. He was here, she gasped. He didn't want money. He wanted the painting. Blanc turned back into the studio. The canvas from the crypt lay face down, but unharmed. Only one thing had changed. A knife was embedded in the wooden beam beside it. A warning. The police arrived. 10 minutes later, Constable Swan looked both horrified and baffled. No sign of forced entry, he said, pacing. They knew the layout. Went for the painting. Took nothing else. Blanc stood over the fallen canvas. He didn't touch it. He didn't want to destroy it, he said softly. He wanted to scare her. Send a message, Swan frowned. What? Kind of thief warns their victim? Not a thief, Blanc said. A handler, a cleaner. Someone sent to retrieve something precious. And if they can't, they make sure no one else does. He looked at Clara. You're in danger now. Not because of what you've seen. but because of what Arthur hid in plain sight. Clara shivered. I think he knew this would happen, she whispered. Blanc nodded. Yes, which is why he didn't trust the police, or the gallery board, or even Lady Althorpe. He turned back to Swan. I need a list. Everyone who had access to this building in the last 6 weeks. Cleaners, curators, deliveries, maintenance. Swan scribbled notes. Right away. Blanc looked out the window. And I need to know if any of them had an accent that wasn't from here. French. Or Belgian. That night, Clara stayed at the Rose Hill Inn. Under police watch. Blanc didn't sleep. Instead, he laid out every known copy of Arthur's hidden eye photos, sketches, notes, and placed them beside the crypt canvas. He circled one shared symbol, a triangle in the corner of each dot in hidden eye. It was hidden in the flames. In Denov's. It was etched into the floor. A triangle. 3 sides, 3 people? Or 3 truths. Blanc sat back, and he remembered what Clara had said weeks ago, almost in passing. Arthur once told me there are 3 kinds of secrets. The ones we keep from others, the ones we keep from ourselves, and the ones we pass on. Outside, across the chapel yard, a figure stood behind the trees, watching the light in the studio. Gloved hands held a phone to their ear. Yes, the figure whispered. She has it. But he's getting close. A pause. Then a nod. The voice was calm. Measured. Double quotes. She won't live long enough to share it. Chapter 15. The artist who died twice the next morning. Benoit Blanc sat at the edge of the breakfast room at the Rose Hill Inn, a cup of black coffee cooling beside his notebook. Outside, the sky was overcast again, thin clouds like gauze draped across the sun. But inside his mind, the pieces had begun to sharpen. Lucien Deneuve, a name buried under 2 decades of ash and hearsay. Officially, the French artist had died in a fire in Montreuil in 2004. Studio accident. No body recovered, just charred remnants and a hastily closed investigation. But even before that, Deneuve had been a ghost in the art world, a provocateur, a signature that appeared only when something dangerous followed. His last known work had been impounded for containing fragments of a classified legal document. He was an artist who painted with secrets, and now his mark had turned up in Arthur Montgomery's hidden studio. Blanc closed the notebook and stood. At the Rose Hill Library, a small room with arched windows and musty carpets. Blanc requested the gallery's archival catalogs. A single elderly librarian, Miss Horrocks, retrieved them with enthusiasm. These are the ones from Arthur's tenure, she said. He wrote the notes himself. Very tidy. Blanc flipped through the brittle pages. And there, buried in a catalog, from 1997, he found the entry, loaned, untitled, Paris No. 5. Anonymous. Acquired through private dealer. Marked with crescent symbol. Placed in storage at Arthur's request. Removed from rotation. 1999. There was a note beside it, in Arthur's own hand. Lucien, don't be ridiculous. He's dead. Or worse, forgotten. Blanc tapped the page thoughtfully. So Arthur had known. Not just suspected. He'd received or acquired a Deneuve piece nearly 30 years ago. Hidden it. Never spoken of it again. And yet, somehow, in his final months, it reappeared. This time behind a false panel. And then Arthur painted Hidden Eye. Back at the gallery, Clara met him by the west wing. I've made a list of all the works Arthur mentioned, but never showed publicly, she said, holding up a notebook. Some have no titles, just sketches and initials, but 3 had a crescent symbol beside them in the margin. She flipped to a page. Look here. C.S. Fog Mirror, March 4th. That's the same time Deneuve was presumed dead. Blanc nodded slowly. He was still active, he murmured. Still painting, but not for galleries. Clara frowned. Then for who? That, Blanc said, is the question. Later that afternoon, Blanc made a call to an old contact in Paris, a retired Interpol investigator named Francois Leroux, who'd spent 10 years chasing art thefts and smuggled relics through the catacombs and nightclubs of the city. Lucien Deneuve? Leroux laughed bitterly. That man is like vapor. Half the people who bought his paintings never knew they'd done it. Did you ever meet him? Blanc asked. Once, Leroux said. Late 90s. He showed up at an auction with an umbrella and a bottle of absinthe. Spoke in riddles. Told me, art is just confession disguised as value. I never saw him again. Did he die in that fire? Leroux was quiet. Officially? Yes, unofficially. I'm not sure anyone really wanted to find out. Why not? Because, Leroux said, Lucien Deneuve didn't forge paintings. He forged histories. He painted things that hadn't happened yet, or things that weren't supposed to be. Remembered. Blanc's fingers tightened around the phone. And if I told you his mark just turned up in an English murder investigation, I'd tell you, Leroux said slowly, that someone just threw open a door that was meant to stay shut. That night, Clara returned to the studio one last time before bed. The painting Deneuve's still sat under cloth, but when she stepped inside, she froze. The studio door was open. She'd locked it, she was certain. Nothing else seemed disturbed. Nothing stolen. But on the floor, just beneath Arthur's workbench, was a small, neatly folded square of paper. Clara opened it. There was no message. Just a copy of Arthur's painting, Hidden Eye hand-drawn in ink. And beneath it, a single line. He painted the fire, but not the spark. Clara didn't sleep that night, and neither did Blanc, because whatever Arthur had uncovered in that final painting, it hadn't ended with Simon Vale. It had only just begun. Chapter 16. The spark. Following morning dawned pale and anxious. Rosehill's quiet felt tense now, not peaceful. A stillness before a storm. Something had shifted with the discovery of Deneuve's painting, something intangible, yet undeniable. It was no longer just a case of murder. It was a question of why Arthur was chosen to carry a truth someone had tried very hard to bury. Benoit Blanc sat at the breakfast table, Clara's folded drawing in front of him. The ink rendering of Hidden Eye was flawless, precise, almost mechanical. Not Arthur's hand, nor Clara's. Someone had copied it. Deliberately, and the message beneath it, he painted the fire. But not the spark haunted him. He thought of the phrase again and again. The fire was Simon, but the spark? That was someone else. Blanc returned to the gallery before it opened. The curator, Mr. Yarwood's nervous assistant, gave him quiet access to the archives again. He pulled out everything related to March 2004, the month Deneuve died. That's when he found it, buried in a pile of correspondence. A letter addressed to Arthur from the National Museum of Modern Art in Paris. The subject line read, Re la verit retenue, returned to sender. Blanc opened it. Inside was a note. Arthur. The piece was declined. Too unstable. Too dangerous. Please do not involve the institution again. C. On the back was a customs form. A returned shipment. The sender. Allow. Deneuve, using the alias Charles Rene. The destination? Arthur Montgomery, Rosehill. Blanc exhaled. So Lucien Deneuve hadn't just contacted Arthur. He had sent him something. A painting. Possibly that painting. And the museum had rejected it before Arthur even opened the crate. But why? That afternoon, Blanc sat across from Clara in the quiet of Arthur's studio. Do you remember any painting Arthur called Les Vertus? He asked. Clara frowned. He never used French titles around me. He said it felt pretentious. Blanc smiled. Faintly, It translates to the truth withheld. Clara blinked. Wait, that phrase, he used it once, last winter, when someone from the London press tried to profile him. He told them the truth withheld is often more dangerous than the lie spoken. And he meant it. Blanc stood and walked over to the hidden painting, the one with the crescent signature. He studied it again, the face in the middle, the spirals of smoke, the unease. What if this was La Vérité writ anew? He murmured. What if this was the painting Deneuve sent him? A message, a warning, a spark. Clara nodded slowly, and Arthur responded. With hidden eye. Blanc tapped the frame, and someone didn't like the answer. By nightfall, Blanc had booked a secure call with Francois Leroux again. He showed the Parisian detective the customs form. Leroux's voice dropped. Rene. Yes, that was one of Deneuve's aliases, used for international transfers. There was one piece sent under that name that disappeared before the Montreuil fire. No record of it being received. But we suspected he sent it to a private contact in England. Arthur, Blanc confirmed. And here's the real twist, Leroux added. That fire Deneuve died in? Yes. It wasn't the first time someone tried to burn his studio. Blanc froze. What do you mean? There was a smaller fire. Months earlier. Covered up. Deneuve believed someone was trying to silence him. He wrote to a contact in England. Said if anything happened, they were to protect the truth withheld. Blanc leaned back, everything crystallizing. Arthur wasn't just a recipient of a controversial painting. He was Deneuve's safety net. That night, Blanc returned to his room and laid the two paintings side-by-side photographs. Not originals. La Vérité writ anew, Deneuve's chaotic, faceless horror. Hidden eye, Arthur's. Quiet, symbolic indictment. He studied the composition. The echoes between them. Then he noticed something else. In the background of hidden eye, nearly obscured by the brushwork, was a shadow, not a person. Not clearly, but a structure. A church window. One he'd seen before. The very next morning, Clara took him to the old Rose Hill Chapel, now disused except for storage and the occasional village concert. The windows were stained glass, many cracked or faded, but one remained intact. And in the top pane of that window, unmistakably, was the shape from Gissy, Arthur's painting. The same window. Blanc stepped back. Clara, he said quietly. What? Used to be under this chapel? She blinked. The old records say, a crypt, but it was sealed decades ago. Then we need to open it. Why? Blanc looked at her, eyes sharp. Because Arthur didn't just receive the spark. He buried it. Chapter 12. The rain had stopped, but the village of Rosehill remained heavy with silence. Clouds hung low, pressing on the rooftops, and even the birds seemed hesitant to sing. Inside the Althorpe Gallery, the West Wing had been reopened for one night only. Just as Blanc had arranged. The lighting was deliberate, subtle spotlights illuminating the paintings without casting sharp shadows. At the center, on the grand easel where Arthur's body had been found, stood a large cloth-draped canvas. The room was still as a confession box. Blanc stood near the entrance as the guests trickled in, each invited with careful intent. Clara Whittaker arrived first, nervous but composed, standing quietly near the back. Lady Thelma came next, stiff-backed and disapproving, followed by the ever-jittery Constable Swan. Eloise Vale entered alone, her eyes flickering warily across the room. Then came Simon. He wore his best smile, measured, thin-lipped, and took a glass of champagne from the gallery steward without hesitation. He said nothing to Clara, nodded to his wife, then fixed his gaze on the veiled canvas at the front of the room. Blanc stepped forward. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his southern drawl quiet but magnetic. Thank you for joining me on such short notice. Tonight is not a memorial. though it may feel like one. Tonight is a viewing not of art, but of truth. The room stiffened slightly. Blanc gestured to the canvas. This painting was not part of the official collection. It was removed, hidden, but it was meant to be here. Arthur Montgomery intended it as the centerpiece of this room. He turned to the audience, and someone killed him to prevent that. Collective breath was held. Blanc moved slowly toward the easel. This painting, titled Only Hidden Eye, is many things. Symbolic, emotional, disturbing. But above all, it is honest. It tells the truth Arthur couldn't speak aloud. About what? Happened years ago. About betrayal. About fear. He reached for the cloth. Simon shifted behind him, hands tightening slightly. Blanc paused. But before we reveal the painting, let me tell you what we've learned. He began to walk slowly, deliberately. Arthur Montgomery discovered a forgery. A carefully constructed lie sold as art. He knew the forger his former pupil. But rather than expose him then, he waited. He painted. He put everything into canvas and oil. A story. A moment. A reckoning. He stopped in front of Simon. That forger was you. Simon's smile faltered. You created a false painting to impress a donor, then destroyed the evidence. In a fire. Arthur let it go publicly. But he painted you, Simon, standing beside that fire, holding your shame. Simon's eyes darted toward the covered canvas. He intended to reveal it this week, but you found out. Maybe Clara said too much. Maybe Arthur dropped a hint. Either way, you returned to the gallery the night before the unveiling. You came. Through the west entrance. You knew where to look because you'd seen the sketch once, years ago. You saw Hidden Eye hanging there, and you panicked. Silence. Even Eloise looked stunned. You confronted Arthur. He refused to take it down. You struggled. And then, whether in rage or desperation, you pushed him. He fell, hit the corner of the easel. The glass behind him shattered. And you staged the rest. Blanc moved back toward the canvas. You wiped the glass, poured the wine. You made. It looked peaceful, but it was not. Simon stepped forward. You have no proof, he hissed. I have the painting, Blanc said quietly, and with that, he pulled the cloth away. The room gasped. The canvas was haunting. Swirls of darkness encased. A burning room. And at its center stood a man, Simon, unmistakably younger, holding a smoldering canvas in his hands. His face was not one of triumph, but guilt. Behind him, the shadow of Arthur, watching, judging painted in gray at the bottom. In Arthur's handwriting, the eye of God sees even in the dark. Simon backed away. Eloise stared at the painting, then at her husband. You told me it was a lie, she whispered. Blanc turned to her. You were never the target, Mrs. Vale, but you were a shield. He knew your name would protect him. Until it didn't. Simon turned toward the door, but two officers stood there now, summoned quietly by Constable Swan. Simon Vale, Swan said, reading from a slip of paper, you are under arrest for the murder of Arthur Montgomery. Simon laughed once short, bitter. Over a painting? No, Blanc said softly, over what you saw in it. As Simon was let out, Lady Thelma turned to Blanc. Do you believe that painting was justice? He looked at the canvas once. More. No, ma'am, he said. Justice is never paint on a wall. But truth? That's a start. Chapter 13. The will in the window the next morning. Rosehill felt different. The rain had stopped entirely. The sun returned, meek but welcome, casting a pale golden light across the village green. Birds sang again. The postman whistled. It was as if the town had, at last, exhaled. But inside Yarwood and Son solicitors, the air remained heavy. Clara Whitaker sat nervously across from Mr. Gerald Yarwood, who blinked behind thick spectacles. As he adjusted the pages of Arthur Montgomery's final will and testament, Blanc stood behind her, calm, silent, hands folded behind his back. He didn't need to speak. Not yet, I must admit, Yarwood muttered. I did not expect this clause to activate under these conditions. Meaning? Blanc asked. Yarwood cleared his throat. Arthur left specific instructions. If his death occurred under unnatural circumstances, his personal effects were to be handled privately, not by Lady Althorpe, not by the gallery trustees, but by Miss Clara Whittaker. Clara blinked. Me? Indeed. Yarwood turned the page. Clause 47. To Miss Clara Whittaker, I leave my private studio, its contents, and all items held in safe deposit at Marleycombe Bank. She alone will understand what to do with them. Clara's hand trembled. Slightly. I don't understand. Why me? Blanc answered before Yarwood could. Because you saw him as a person, he said gently. Not a genius, not a legacy, just Arthur. And he knew you wouldn't let the truth be buried with him. Yarwood reached beneath the desk and pulled out a sealed envelope. Additionally, there was a personal letter, to be opened in your presence, with a witness. That's you, Mr. Blanc. Clara took it with trembling fingers. Her name was written on the front in Arthur's neat handwriting. For Clara, if this reaches you, I am gone. She opened it slowly. Inside were just 3 paragraphs, handwritten in ink that had faded slightly at the edges. My dear Clara, if this letter finds you, then something has gone wrong. Maybe my heart gave out, or maybe the truth finally caught up with me. Either way, know this. I trusted you to see me clearly, and I trust you now to protect what must be remembered. The painting I called Hidden Eye is not just a confession. It is a mirror. What we see in it says more about ourselves than the subject. Simon thought it exposed him, but it only reflected what he feared most being seen. That's why he destroyed so much. That's why he came for me. I leave you the studio, and I leave you my regrets. Use them as you will, but please never let them turn to silence. With affection and faith, Arthur. Clara didn't speak for a long time. Then quietly, he knew. Blanc nodded. Yes, but he chose to paint, not accuse. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. What do I do now? Blanc smiled gently. You open the studio. You tell the story. You let him be remembered for who he really was. Later that day, they unlocked the small outbuilding behind Arthur's cottage, the one no one had entered since his death. It smelled of linseed oil, turpentine, and dust. Paintbrushes lay scattered across the workbench. Canvases leaned against the walls, some finished, some abandoned mid-stroke. A kettle sat beside a single chipped mug. And in the corner, beneath a white sheet, was one final painting. Clara pulled the cloth away. It was her. Not stylized, not flattered. Just her caught mid-laugh, brush in hand, looking toward the light as though unaware she was being seen. Tears welled in her eyes. He never showed me this, she whispered. Blanc stepped beside her. Some things are too personal for the gallery. That evening, back at the Rosehill Inn, Blanc stood at his window, watching the wind rustle through the trees. Below, the village moved gently on, children chasing kites, a dog barking at the bell of the bakery, 2 teenagers sharing a cigarette by the green. He poured a glass of whiskey and held it up toward the open air. To truth, he said softly, and to the ones who dare to see it. He drank. And somewhere behind him, the clock ticked on. Chapter 14. Echoes in oil. The days after Simon Vale's arrest passed quietly, but never idly. For Clara Whittaker, each morning began the same way, a long walk down to Arthur's studio. The letter folded neatly in her coat pocket, as if his words could still warm her against the early chill. The key once heavy in her hand now fit. The lock with something like muscle memory. She moved through the space with growing ease, cataloging his brushes, sealing tubes of pigment, wiping down the palette where he had last mixed color. But there was still so much left behind, unfinished canvases, sketches, stacked portfolios bound with string. She'd begun photographing each one, cataloging them digitally, as Arthur had once taught her. She treated every smudge of charcoal like scripture, every corner of oil as testimony. And then, on the fourth day, she found the painting. It was hidden behind a false panel in the north wall, just above the bookshelf. The seam was barely visible. She'd found it by accident while dusting the old globe that stood next to the chair he always read in. Behind the panel, a single canvas, wrapped in rough linen. No frame. No title. No signature. Chapter 10. Dr. Edwin Marsh. The name had been there from the beginning, not scrawled in blood, not whispered in a dying breath. Simply ... listed. Emergency contact. Dr. Edwin Marsh. On Arthur Montgomery's medical file, found in the coroner's report. It had struck everyone as a clerical oversight. After all, Clara had been the one sent to check on him. The gallery staff, the villagers all believed Arthur had no close friends, no living family. But Arthur had chosen Dr. Marsh to be the one they called first. And Arthur Montgomery did not do anything without intent. That morning, Benoit Blanc took the train to Chiswick, a sleepy university town an hour from Rosehill, where the red brick buildings curled around old libraries and hedgerows as if trying to remember their own histories. A place where secrets liked to settle, like dust in the corners. Blanc arrived at St. Raphael's College, where Dr. Edwin Marsh still held the honorary title of Senior Fellow in Art History, though he had long since retreated from public lectures. Receptionist at the front gate was reluctant but polite. "He doesn't usually accept visitors, sir," she said, fidgeting. "But I can ring through." Blanc smiled gently. "Tell him I'm here regarding Arthur Montgomery and the painting called Hidden Eye. That did it. 10 minutes later, he was ushered through winding corridors to a narrow office at the top of a turreted stairwell. The door opened without a knock. And there stood Dr. Edwin Marsh, mid-70s, slender, perfectly groomed, wearing a slate-gray cardigan over a pressed shirt. His eyes were the color of tarnished steel, and they did not blink. "Mr. Blanc," he said, "I've been expecting you." Blanc entered without comment. The office was as silent as a church, and just as reverent. Every book was precisely aligned. A framed photograph of Arthur sat beside a stack of journals, and on the wall, a single canvas turned backward. "You knew Arthur well," Blanc said. Marsh gave a half-smile. "I loved him. In my way." That caught Blanc's attention. "But love," Marsh continued, turning to face the desk, "is rarely enough for a man like Arthur. He preferred truth and control." Blanc sat across from him. "He named you as his emergency contact, but you weren't mentioned in his will. No one in Rosehill seemed to know you even existed." Marsh's fingers curled around a glass paperweight. "He erased me," he said, not bitterly, but like reciting a fact. After what happened with the painting, he wanted distance, silence. Blanc leaned in. "Tell me about the painting." Hidden Eye. Marsh was quiet for a long time. Then he exhaled. "It wasn't meant to be shown." "That's true. Arthur never painted for an audience, only for himself. But that one ... wasn't just private. It was incriminating." "Incriminating how?" "It was a confession," Marsh said. "In oil, layered, coded, disturbing. At the center, he painted the act. The actual moment." "What act?" Marsh's eyes darkened. "Years ago, when Arthur still taught restoration, there was an incident. A fire, officially ruled accidental. but unofficially. It was believed someone started it to destroy a forged acquisition. The forgery had embarrassed a donor. Arthur always suspected who did it, but he never told the college. He said he'd handle it himself. Did he? Yes, and then he painted it. Not the fire, but what came before. The lie, the betrayal. And someone else knew? Blanc asked. Oh, they knew, and they wanted it gone. Blanc stood. Who was in the painting, Edwin? Marsh didn't speak. Instead, he turned to the reversed canvas on the wall and slowly lifted it down. Then he turned it around. It wasn't. Hidden eye, but it was familiar. A portrait of Simon Vale, younger, hair longer, wearing the same smirk he still wore at dinner parties. In the background, nearly invisible, was a figure in shadow, watching. Arthur kept this one for reference, Marsh said quietly, to remind himself of the way people look when they lie to your face. Blanc stared at it. And the other? Painting? He asked. The one that vanished? Marsh said, nodding. That one showed Simon again, only this time, standing beside the fire, holding a canvas. Blanc felt the pieces slide into place. Arthur knew Simon forged the painting. He said slowly, knew he started the fire to cover it up. And he painted it all? Marsh nodded. And then, just before the unveiling, someone realized that painting might go on display. They panicked. And killed him. Blanc finished. Marsh looked. Out the window. I told Arthur not to include it in the collection, he whispered. I begged him. But he said, what is art if it tells no truth? Blanc's eyes softened. Did you know he'd hidden it in the gallery? I didn't, Marsh said, but I should have guessed. They sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, Blanc stood. Thank you, he said. This changes everything. Marsh nodded, but didn't rise. As Blanc reached the door, Marsh spoke once more. Be careful, he said. Simon isn't stupid, and he doesn't panic unless he's cornered. Blanc turned the handle. That's all right, he said softly. I'm not hunting him yet. I'm still painting the frame. Back on the train, rain pattered softly against the window. Blanc stared out at the dark countryside. Arthur had painted the truth. Simon had tried to erase it. But art, as Arthur once said, never truly disappears. It waits. In galleries. In notebooks. And in the eyes of the dead. Chapter 11. The man in the photograph, Simon Vale, opened the door with the tight smile of a man expecting to be admired. He wore a navy waistcoat over a crisp shirt, his hair just imperfect enough to look natural. Behind him, the Vale residence looked as it always had, controlled, curated, cold. Detective Blanc, he said, stepping aside. To what do I owe the pleasure? Blanc entered without returning the smile. I thought it time we spoke properly. Simon gestured to the sitting room. Eloise is out, I'm afraid. Charity luncheon. Blanc nodded as he stepped inside, letting his eyes scan the space, noting how every item in the room had been chosen for impact, not comfort. The books were for show. The ark was safe, except one piece. Over the mantel hung a portrait Blanc hadn't seen before. A self-portrait of Simon, younger, more arrogant. The same painting Marsh had shown him. He filed the detail away. I've been reading up on your time at St. Raphael's, Blanc said. You studied art restoration. Simon sat, his smile now thinner. Briefly. And you met Arthur Montgomery there. Simon gave a small shrug. He was an eccentric, generous when he liked you, brutal when he didn't. And did he? Like you? Simon looked Blanc dead in the eyes. He tolerated me. Blanc smiled politely, then reached into his coat and laid the photograph on the coffee table. The one of the missing painting. Simon didn't move. Recognize this? Blanc asked. No, Simon said too quickly. Blanc watched him. It was found in Miss Whitaker's garden. Someone placed it there, hoping she'd be curious, hoping she'd bring it to me. Simon leaned back. Sounds like the work of an admirer or an amateur. Blanc tilted his head. Or someone trying to get ahead of a discovery, trying to control how a story is told before the evidence becomes public. Simon's mask didn't break, but his fingers tapped rhythmically on the armrest. Blanc leaned forward, lowering his voice. You forged a painting, years ago. Something meant to impress a donor. But Arthur discovered it. And rather than expose you, he painted the truth. Simon said nothing. Blanc continued. When Arthur planned to unveil that painting in the gallery, you panicked. Maybe you thought it was buried in his private studio. But when you saw it missing, you realized he was finally going to show the world. Simon's lips parted. You have no proof. Not yet, Blanc said smoothly. But I have motive, and I have something better than proof. I have your face. He tapped the photo. This painting doesn't just suggest guilt. It frames it. You're in it, Simon, the man by the fire. Simon's voice hardened. You're bluffing. Am I? Blanc stood. I spoke to Dr. Marsh. Simon's eyes flickered just for a second. Then steel. Marsh, he said, scoffing. That bitter little man. Arthur kept him like a broken trophy. He was always jealous. He wanted the painting to himself. Funny, Blanc said. He said the same about you. Simon rose, now fully engaged, the air in the room tightening like a noose. Let's suppose, Simon said carefully, that I was involved in something regrettable years ago. That painting wasn't just a risk to me. It was a risk to Eloise, our reputation, everything we've built. Blanc met his gaze. You mean everything you've stolen? Silence. Then Simon stepped closer, voice low. If Arthur painted me, if that's what he did, then maybe he deserved what happened. Is that a confession? Blanc asked softly. Simon smiled. It's a hypothesis. Blanc stepped back. One last thing, he said. Arthur's body was found with a glass of wine. Red, but the autopsy found no wine in his system. Simon said nothing. No fingerprints on the glass. Not even his. So I asked myself, who would stage a glass of wine beside a corpse? Who would know Arthur always drank red during showings? Simon's jaw tightened. Only someone who knew his rituals. Someone close, or someone who'd studied him. Blanc turned toward the door. Oh, and Simon? He paused at the threshold. I'll be hosting a private viewing at the gallery tomorrow night. Just a few guests. I think you should come. You may find the centerpiece illuminating. Simon didn't respond, but his silence said enough. Evening, back at the gallery, Blanc met Clara in the West Wing. I want the easel ready, he told her. And the lights angled just right. She looked at him nervously. You think he'll come? I think he has no choice, Blanc said. He needs to know what I know, what I've seen. Clara hesitated. And if he panics? Blanc gave her a small, calm smile. Chapter 7. A second visitor. It was late afternoon when Clara Whitaker came knocking. Benoit Blanc had returned to his room at the Rose Hill Inn, a modest but well-kept guest house overlooking the green, and had just settled into his armchair. With a sheaf of notes when he heard the tap at his door. She stood in the hallway, hair slightly damp from the mist, hands fidgeting with the sleeves of her cardigan. I'm sorry to bother you, she said quickly. I remembered something. Blanc gestured gently. Please, come in, Miss Whitaker. She stepped inside, clearly nervous, and sat down on the edge of the room's only other chair. I didn't realize I'd forgotten it, she began. Not until I was walking home past the gallery this afternoon. I kept hearing the sound again, the footsteps I told you about. Blanc leaned forward. Yes, you said they were moving away from you. They were. But I didn't tell you. There were 2 sets. Blanc's brow rose slightly. Clara looked down, ashamed. I think I was in shock when I spoke to the police. I just kept remembering the scream, the body, the blood. But now it's clearer. She took a deep breath. When I was walking toward the locked room, I heard the first footsteps, slow, heavy, like someone in dress shoes. But just before I opened the door, I heard a second sound, lighter, faster. Not footsteps, exactly more. Like a rustle, shoes scraping against stone. And it came from inside the gallery. Blanc's voice was calm, but keen. You believe someone else was already there? I do, or had just been there. The door was ajar barely, but there was movement. I felt it. Blanc nodded slowly. And you're sure the door was not locked when you arrived? It was unlocked when I touched it, Clara said. I assumed Arthur had left it open by. Mistake. Blanc stood, pacing lightly toward the window. If someone entered before you, and left just before you arrived, then they may have been hiding in the gallery all along, possibly behind one of the tapestries, or the curtain near the mirror. Clara shivered. Why would they hide? Perhaps they had not intended to. Kill, Blanc murmured. Or perhaps they needed something else first, and Arthur's death was a necessity. He turned back to her. This second presence. Did you hear a door open or shut? A sound? She shook her head. No, just movement. And a breath? A breath? She nodded. Right before I touched the handle, I heard something soft. Not a word, not a gasp, just the sort of breath you take when you're trying not to make one. Blanc stared at her a moment longer. You have an extraordinary memory, Miss Whitaker. Clara flushed. I have synesthesia. I remember things. Strangely. Sounds have textures to me. Those footsteps, they weren't just sounds. They were colors. Shapes. He smiled. Then I suspect you may prove essential. She stood, hesitating. Do you think they saw me? Blanc didn't answer at first. Then, softly, if they were clever, yes. And if they were dangerous, they made sure you didn't see them. Clara's hands tightened on her coat. Should I be worried? Blanc walked to the small side table and poured her a cup of tea. I think, he said calmly, you should avoid walking home alone tonight. Later, as the mist settled over Rosehill like a veil, Blanc stood once more in front of the galleries. Closed doors. He imagined Arthur standing at that mirror, unaware someone approached from behind. He imagined 2 sets of shoes, one hesitant, one swift, and a third figure hiding just beyond the canvas. The killer had returned for something. Perhaps they had retrieved it, or perhaps they had left it behind. Far across the village, in a darkened room with no lights and drawn curtains, a figure watched the window. They held a glove in one hand. It was smudged with oil paint. And blood. Chapter 8. The canvas that wasn't there. Next morning, Benoit Blanc returned to the Althorpe Gallery, not with fanfare, but with a file. It was thin and well worn, wrapped in twine and labeled in Arthur Montgomery's own looping handwriting. West Wing, Private Collection, Final, Inventory. Lady Thelma had handed it to him without enthusiasm, but without resistance either. Arthur was meticulous, she'd said. He itemized everything, down to the bloody curtain rods. Now Blanc sat in the far corner of the gallery's west, wing with the file spread open on a makeshift desk. Sunlight filtered softly through the lead glass windows, dappling the floor in gold. Somewhere in the building, a janitor's radio murmured the sound of distant jazz. Blanc took a slow breath and turned to the first page. Inventory list, West Wing, Private Exhibition. Unveiling April 19th. Portrait of a young man with candle. School of Rembrandt River at dusk. Unsigned oils. 19th C. Self-portrait with books. Eloise Vale. Gift. Sovereign hunger. mixed media. Anonymous Lady and Spaniel, oil on canvas. 1891. Untitled Hidden Eye. Arthur's personal favorite, blank, The Hollow Saint. Arthur Montgomery, 1996. Untitled Mirror Display. Placeholder for centerpiece miniature. The Ash Tree, wood. And watercolor Blanc's brow. Furrowed dot there. Between entry 6 and 8 entry 7 was nothing. Just a long blank line. No title, no artist. No medium, no date. He flipped to the back of the file. Nothing, no explanation. He scanned the room again, eyes moving from wall to wall, tracing the placement of each painting, noting where small brass plaques had been set beneath the frames. 10. Works hung. One easel remained, which meant every piece listed had a place. Except 1. Number 7. The missing canvas. Blank stood and walked the perimeter slowly. Each painting matched a listing. He paused at sovereign hunger, an unsettling collage of feathers, bone, and rusted wire. Then at the ash tree, a miniature so small it could be mistaken for a toy. He passed the dog portrait, still slightly ajar on its hinge, and then he stopped. A narrow stretch of wall near. The north-facing window held a frame slightly different from the others, newer, unmarked. A pale shadow on the wall suggested something had once hung there, only to be removed recently. Too recently. He stepped closer. On the skirting board beneath the frame, a faint smear, not paint, not polished. Blood. He crouched, inspecting the edge. The frame had a splinter sharp and jagged. Fresh. As if someone had yanked a painting from the wall in haste. Blank turned back to the inventory. Untitled, he murmured. Hidden Eye. He flipped back to item 6. Untitled, Hidden Eye. Arthur's personal favorite. Could the missing piece be this? Or had Arthur removed Hidden Eye before the unveiling, to replace it with something else? But then, why? Leave it blank? Unless someone else had removed it. And if they had, why? Painting. Removed after a murder, and in its place, silence. He returned to Lady Thelma just after noon. May I ask, he began, if you noticed a gap in the exhibition? She blinked. No, Arthur handled all of that. He left one entry blank. She frowned. He always kept surprises. He said the blank space gave him options. Did he ever discuss a piece he called Hidden Eye? Now she hesitated. Yes. Once. At dinner, about a year ago. He said it was his safest painting. I asked what that meant. He said, because it doesn't need to be seen to say something. Was it valuable? She shook her head. He said it wasn't even beautiful, just necessary. That word again. Blank turned it over in his mind like a coin. Necessary. Beautiful. Not expensive. Necessary. He returned to the gallery just as the sun dipped low enough to stretch. Long shadows across the floor. And then he saw a dot near the skirting board below. The missing painting's spot of fallen tag. He picked it. Up. The handwriting was unmistakable. The eye of God sees even in the dark. No artist. No date. Not just that one phrase. Benoit Blanc closed his eyes. Just briefly. Something had been seen. Something dangerous. And someone had gone to great lengths to remove it. That evening, as he prepared his notes and waited for supper, a message arrived at the inn. A single envelope slid under his door. No stamp. No return address. Inside. A single photograph. It was of the missing painting. And scrawled across the back in pen. It was never meant to be displayed. Chapter 9. The midnight visitor. That night, the rain returned with the persistence of a rumor. It tapped against the windows of the Rose Hill Inn like a steady, insistent knock, soft but impossible to ignore. The village had gone to bed early, as if collectively deciding that sleep might hush the unease settling over them like mist. But Benoit Blanc did not sleep. He sat by the window in his room. Lights dimmed, a cup of cooling tea on the sill beside him. In his lap rested the photograph, the one slid under his door with no explanation and no name. On its front, the missing painting, a strange, abstract canvas rendered in muted greens and bruised blues. At the center, a single black circle that seemed to look back dot, and on the back, the word still lingered. It was never meant to be displayed. He had no way of knowing who had sent it, but he had an idea who might come looking for it, Dot. So he waited. The innkeeper, a kind, elderly man named Mr. Beckett, had quietly agreed to keep the side door unlocked tonight. Just this once, he'd muttered. I don't want to know what for. It was just after 2 a.m. when the hallway creaked. Not loudly, Dot, not carelessly, Dot, but with the precision of someone who believed they were alone. Blank remained still. The doorknob turned slowly, soundlessly. Shape entered. Not large, not small, slim, wrapped in a dark coat. A scarf concealed the face. No flashlight, just the faint glow from the moon through the curtains. They took 3 steps into the room, then stopped. Benoit Blanc flicked on the lamp. The intruder froze, half in shadow. He didn't raise his voice. I believe you're looking for this. He held up the photograph. The intruder, startled but not panicked, lowered the scarf. Clara Whitaker. She looked terrified.